Today, we are diving into an entirely different section of the Bible. I say entirely different because the wisdom literature is a completely different genre than the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and the historical books. Wisdom literature is meant to be taken as exactly that, wisdom. Much like the parables of Jesus, our authors use everyday illustrations and allusions to give advice, philosophize big theological questions, and also just give us ways to express our emotions. The wisdom literature contains one of the longest books of the Bible, Psalms, the most salacious book of the Bible, Song of Songs, 2 books that have inspired many songs, throw pillows, and other creative tchotchkes, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and it also has the oldest book in the Bible, the book of Job. The book of Job is the gateway to the wisdom literature, and because it sits right between the historical books and the Psalms, a well-known wisdom text, many interpret this book as historical. But I'm here to tell you that a story about God and Satan making a wager over how quickly a faithful man will curse God is not a likely candidate for historical truth. Instead, this amazing and rousing book was meant to provide a story in which to answer the age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? It even opens like most fairy tales do. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This poor man Job has everything before him, a large family, a loving wife, large plot of land with many animals and crops upon it. Then Satan starts wagering with God. Satan makes the claim that of course Job is the most faithful man on earth. Look at all that he has. He has no reason to curse God or even be unfaithful. All he has is blessing. So God and Satan make a wager. Satan is allowed to curse, kill, maim, and take away anything he wants from Job, but he must not kill Job himself. So messenger upon messenger comes to Job to tell him that his oxen and donkeys have been taken, the sheep and servants were burned up from a fire from heaven, and his children are all killed in a freak house collapse accident. Job immediately laments, cries out in despair and protest, but he does not curse God. So Satan afflicts him with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Despite his wife telling him to just curse God and die, a compassionate thing, since it would mean a quick end to all of this, Job will not quit. His faith and his endurance remains, and he responds, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In this way, Job is even more pious than those of us that may not curse God, but give up on God altogether at the signs of catastrophe and great evil. Job endures the trouble from God because Job understands that God can't just be a God of blessing. We have to accept a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, and recognize that this combination doesn't mean we always get the best in life. As Jesus says in the middle of his speech on loving our enemies, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Jesus was making the same point that Job is. We are all living in this world receiving blessings and curses, so we must not judge others for what they do or do not do. That is God's job. Unfortunately, judgment is exactly what Job receives from his friends and for nearly 20 chapters of the book. In these judgments, you hear all the common tropes we give even today when suffering falls on people. It has to be your fault. You weren't faithful enough. You didn't pray enough. God is just setting you back on the right path, disciplining you. At least the last friend, Eliphaz, takes the focus off of Job and instead just sings the praises of God and how God is above reproach. Versions of this we might hear today are, we don't know God's plans, or God gives you only what you can handle, and everything happens for a reason. These are, however, not helpful to the person sitting in great pain and grief. Job remains forthright, even stating the faithful line, for I know that my Redeemer or Vindicator lives, Job 19:25. And eventually God breaks on the scene. He puts the friends in their place, redeeming Job, and also responds to Job's cry of, what did I do, God? Tell me. But God is not nearly as compassionate as we expect him to be, maybe even apologizing for the wager and all this unjust suffering, but instead he turns on Job. Who are you to question me? It might seem harsh, but this is a God that uses our intellect to comfort us in the midst of trial. A God that reminds us of our place within the cosmos. The wisdom that is found in the book of Job is that wisdom is not in human hands at all, only in God's. Humans will never understand God's ways, and God does not need to tell us the whys of life. Of course, this is frustrating, but what a mature lesson that we all at some times need to learn. We are going to see blessings pour on the righteous and the unrighteous and reign just the same. It is not for us to say why or even question God in that why. Although I will confess, I do it all the time. Not to worry, God can handle our questions just like God accepted Job's. Now that is plenty enough time spent on Job. The next book of wisdom literature is the grand book of Psalms. Many ascribe it to King David, but most archaeologists and scholars today would say that they were written for King David, not by him. Tricky translations. Since our Psalms were the first worship hymns of the Jewish faith, it is far more likely to believe they were written by priests and others working in the temple. Knowing the context of the Psalms will help us to understand them better. Now, that word context you have heard before in these sessions, it's one of those biblical tools we want you to use to help you read the Bible faithfully. The book of Psalms is actually going to take all of our biblical toolkit to interpret. So here are the rest of the tools we'll be using here in the Psalms. Context, exegesis, Scripture interprets Scripture. I just used this in Job when I compared his words to Jesus' words. Canon within the canon. I will point out all of these tools as we use them. Now, before you get too worried about the 150 chapters of Psalms, I won't be reading all the Psalms or even attempting to summarize them all. Instead, I'm going to do what the great scholars of Psalms do. I'm going to categorize them into 5 themes: Psalms of praise and thanksgiving, Psalms of lament, Psalms of trust, Psalms of royalty, Psalms of wisdom. The first theme, Psalms of praise and thanksgiving, make up the majority of Psalms in the Bible. Even those that could be found under the other categories are for the most part singing God's praises. Let's look at Psalm 100. For this one, I took the NRSV edition. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord is God. It is he that made us, and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. Some of you may hear this and immediately put it to a tune. It is a very common psalm to sing in churches, and it has been modernized through the years. The beauty of the Psalms is in their singability. By singing these ancient poems about God centuries after they were written, they become anew for each new congregation. The author may have intended them for the one holy temple of Jerusalem, but then they were sung in exile, chanted daily in the monasteries and convents of the medieval church, and even still today in the medieval church. And now they are sung in your church. Each time, people sing praises and thanksgiving to God, and each time they are made anew in us. In this way, the biblical tool of context isn't as important as the tools of exegesis, which is reading the whole psalm, not just "For the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever." Reading it all allows you to see the joy of worship itself. Now let's explore a very different genre of psalm, lament. An important expression of emotion, I might even say just as important as praise and thanksgiving. When the world has dealt us a bad hand, hopefully not as bad as Job, we need to lament. We need to be honest with God about what we are feeling. We cannot always hide behind the praise when all our heart is feeling is lament. Take Psalm 13. How long will you forget me, Lord? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I be left to my own wits, agony filling my heart? Daily? How long will my enemy keep defeating me? Look at me, answer me. Lord my God, restore sight to my eyes. Otherwise I'll sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I won. My foes will rejoice over my downfall, but I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. Yes, I will sing to the Lord because he has been good to me. This almost seems like a psalm right out of Job's mouth. The psalmist is upset, wondering when God will finally come to their aid, and yet in the end, they maintain their praise. You can hold hand in hand the challenge and the faith. However, many of you may have only heard that first verse, and without the rest of the psalm, you might guess that the psalmist could only be mad at God. Seeing the whole psalm in its full context allows you to see the range of emotions that the psalmist felt, and we can feel it when we sing it. That is exegesis. We need not be lost in the anger with God. We can consider, like Job, the great magnitude of God's power and work in the world. We can call God out and also recognize our place. We can even be like Jesus on the cross, wondering where God is, and yet also knowing the grand plan in effect. We can be in pain and have faith that God will see us through. These psalms are written by humans just like us, with emotions and experiences just like us. The psalms help us to express our emotions to God, not suppress them. We are allowed to say anything we want to God. God will still love us and be there for us. Just remember the historical books. Psalm 23 is probably the most well-known psalm of all. It is truly the canon within the canon. Now, you might say, what's canon? Well, that's just a word for the works of the Bible that are claimed to be authoritative. Long ago, people had to decide what went into the Bible and what didn't. We will go into more detail in the last episode of this series on that very topic. So we have a set of books that are labeled canon, genuine, authentic, stamped with approval. But we all know there are some pieces of scripture that are just more meaningful than others. Ones people have returned to since they were created, like the story of the Exodus or Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is categorized as a psalm of trust, and it speaks of the great care God has for his people and the everlasting faith we can put in God. Many of you might know this psalm by heart, but I wonder, what version do you know? I'm going to put up 3 different translations of Psalm 23, and I want you to consider which one you are most comfortable with. Is it the New Revised Standard Version? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Is it the King James Version? He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Is it the Common English Bible? You set a table for me right in front of my enemies. You bathe my head in oil. My cup is so full, it spills over. Yes, goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the Lord's house as long as I live. If you take a close look at these 3 different versions, you see some differences. The darkest valley versus the valley of the shadow of death, or dwelling in the house of the Lord forever versus all my whole life long. And it makes us question why we have different translations at all. The well-known and beloved King James Version is not nearly as accurate and inerrant as we like to believe. The Bible is made up of texts that were originally written in Hebrew, the Old Testament, and Greek, the New Testament. We have these original texts or fragments from archaeological digs all around the Holy Land in the ancient Near East. Because of that, we can trust that our scriptures have not been tampered with through the ages. But sometimes we just need new translations that capture the way we speak today and include the newest findings in archaeology and biblical scholarship. While it is true that all of our English translations are a step away from those original texts of Hebrew and Greek, the translators of every version of the Bible are trying to do their best to capture the true meanings and understandings of words. Even Martin Luther struggled with translating the beautiful language of Romans. It just couldn't be communicated with the limitations of his native German language. The King James Version, while a huge achievement at the time, was flawed due to its lack of original sources. While some sources came right from the Hebrew and Greek, they also consulted translations that had previously been made, namely ones coming from Latin. Now imagine that a text that was originally in Greek or Hebrew is now translated into Latin, and then from the Latin into English. You are bound to get some interesting interpretations, like a game of telephone. After the King James Version came dozens of more translations, each toting a new version of the original. Some were more faithful to the original text, while others were more focused on making the ancient words of the original writers contemporary to English speakers today. The Common English Bible is one of those translations that helps us to read the text in our own modern-day language when staying close to the exact phrasing would only confuse. The New Revised Standard Version, updated just recently in 2021, is used most often by scholars and religious leaders because upon its creation, its only focus was to be faithful to the original text so that we can hear it as closely as possible to the original author. That is why in the NRSV translation of Psalm 23, we get darkest valley rather than valley of the shadow of death, because that is what the Hebrew says. In this way, the valley is not metaphorical, but entirely practical. If you are in a real dark valley, you can call on God. Also, dwelling in the house of the Lord forever instead of just the rest of our lives. For the original writer, this was a song for the temple, which means that we can only dwell in the house of the Lord, also known as the temple, until we die. Nowadays, Psalm 23 has become the go-to psalm for funerals and those at the end of their life. These changes that get us closer to the original sources might feel like they're taking the power out of the psalm. Please don't let it. Once again, knowing the context of a psalm should not take away any of the glory of its wisdom. Psalm 23, just like all the other psalms I have read so far, take on new meaning for each new reader and singer. The wisdom literature is meant to be interpreted with our own life experiences. We learn from it and are changed by it. There is a poetic beauty in the King James Version, and it may even serve us better at a graveside, but we can't hang our entire faith on a single verse. We must recognize the multitude of voices singing praise to God, in their own time, in their own language. This psalm was written for a people in the temple, but today we have different ideas of heaven and dark valleys because of what Jesus preached. Let Scripture interpret Scripture, and more importantly, let Scripture interpret your life. Psalms of royalty and wisdom, to just take a turn, are much more contextual to early Judaism and can feel unrelatable to us today. But that doesn't mean we should throw them out, because Scripture interprets Scripture. Many of the royalty psalms have been used to give praise to Jesus, a man the original authors did not know or even could imagine. Look at Psalm 2. Why do the nations rant? Why do the peoples rave uselessly? The earth's rulers take their stand. The leaders scheme together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Come, they say, we will tear off their ropes and throw off their chains. The one who rules in heaven laughs. My Lord makes fun of them. But then God speaks to them angrily. Then he terrifies them with his fury. I hereby appoint my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will announce the Lord's decision. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Just ask me, and I will make the nations your possession. The far corners of the earth will be your property. You will smash them with an iron rod. You will shatter them like a pottery jar. So kings, wise up, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord reverently, trembling. Kiss his feet, or else he will become angry, and your way will be destroyed because his anger ignites in an instant. But all who take refuge in the Lord are truly happy. Do we not know of Jesus as God's begotten Son? This is a psalm to God's anointed. At the writing of it, it was likely meant to speak of an anointed king like David or Solomon, or even in hopes of the many kings of the divided kingdom before exile. But now we read it with much different eyes. When this psalm is sung by a follower of Jesus, some of these phrases take on new meaning in the believer's heart. The psalm transcends its time and place to now speak to the people of Jesus, the King of Kings, Prince of Peace. However, we always need to know the full psalm in its historical context and know who it truly was hoping for: a righteous king on earth, a just king. It is this very understanding of who God's anointed would be that led to Jesus being crucified on the cross, led many to not believe he was the true Messiah, for he was not an earthly king, but so much more. The wisdom psalms also echo scripture. What does Psalm 1 make you think of? The truly happy person doesn't follow wicked advice, doesn't stand on the road of sinners, and doesn't sit with the disrespectful. Instead of doing those things, these persons love the Lord's instruction, and they recite God's instruction day and night. They are like a tree replanted by streams of water, which bears fruit at just the right time, and whose leaves don't fade. Whatever they do succeeds. That's not true for the wicked. They are like dust that the wind blows away, and that's why the wicked will have no standing in the courts of justice, neither will sinners in the assembly of the righteous. The Lord is intimately acquainted with the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked is destroyed. Does this make you think of Proverbs with its language of the wicked and the righteous? Exactly. These wisdom psalms were exactly that, songs to help us to remember these nuggets of truth. So let's dive next into the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is a book that is very often quoted, but rarely read in its entirety. If you did, you would hear the prologue that tells you exactly what is contained in the following chapters, as well as a vision of wisdom personified, as a woman who cries out for people to listen. There is a constant litany of reminders to be wise and not foolish. Then in chapter 10, we reach the little couplets of wisdom in poetic verse that we all know so well, such as, "Train children in the right way, and when old they will not stray," and "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." Or even, "Iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens the wits of another." Some may be less well-known and frankly confusing, like "Vinegar on a wound is one who sings songs to a heavy heart." Or like "A city breached without walls is one who lacks self-control." Much like the laws, we can find within these ancient words wisdom that speaks to us easily today, and others that need more interpretation. Proverbs ends with the description of a capable wife, a Proverbs 31 woman. When read in its entirety, it is truly a woman who is a strong, capable provider for her household, buying land and selling fine linen. She is described as strong, not only socially and maternally, but physically as well. She is the personification of a woman who has mastered these snippets of wisdom. Proverbs was meant to be read, studied, and even memorized in its entirety. Proverbs is a treasure trove of wisdom, easily packaged for us to use, but we have to be careful not to only select those that make the most sense to us, or worse, help us to win an argument. Scripture is to challenge us, not to rebuke others. The next wisdom book, Ecclesiastes, is not so easily taken out into the world on throw pillows or art pieces, but it holds a similar importance in the education of the wisdom literature. It is written by someone named Kohelet, or teacher, preacher in Hebrew. It opens with the famous line, "Vanity of vanities," says the teacher, "vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And there is the root of the whole book. All is hevel. That's the original Hebrew, hevel. Both the things we beloved so much they become idols, and the anxieties we give ourselves on a daily basis. All is hevel. It is normally translated in English as vanities, but a closer idea for most scholars is vapor, something easily here 1 minute and gone the next, fleeting. Vanity does capture that somewhat, but not quite. Our teacher in this book tells us that we must live in the moment. For the author and his audience, this is because, once again, they didn't have a vision of heaven like we do. They believed that our temporary life was all there is, so we must enjoy it. Even though we now believe in heaven, we can still learn from this wisdom. There are the beautiful words of chapter 3, "For everything there is a season." Most of you might think this type of thinking would lead to agnostic or even atheist beliefs, but never does the teacher say that we are to do whatever we wish. Instead, we are simply to enjoy the good and the bad. We are to enjoy all that God has granted us. When we live life for the moment and not for what comes next, we fully appreciate the gift of life that God has given. An atheist would try to find meaning in the moments, but for us as Christians, and for this teacher as a Jewish believer, the moments have meaning because of the Creator who gave them to us. There is a time for everything, and everything has its time. Let's recognize the holy in the everyday. Song of Songs is the next book in wisdom literature, and it is the most controversial. The book used to be hidden away, literally, from young men's eyes and condemned for centuries. But at the same time, it is beloved and has become a righteous text that has even overcame its scandalous beginnings. Most biblical scholars believe that the Song of Songs, though referencing the daughters of Jerusalem and King Solomon, was originally just a love story between two people. However, upon further readings and many commentaries from early church fathers, the meaning and symbolism behind this tryst in the garden becomes a love story between God and humankind, sometimes more specifically, the church. Those interpreters, commenters, made this story change and become anew. Much like those psalms that speak to each of us on an individual level, this love story spoke something fresh to the early religious believers. However, if you prefer to read the Psalms over the Song of Songs, that's okay. That is another understanding of a canon within a canon. Some books are just more important for us than others. The final book of wisdom, Lamentations, brings us right back to where we left off in Jewish history, the exile. The first 4 chapters describe life under the Babylonian siege. The 5th chapter reflects what happened immediately after the fall of Jerusalem. Some of you might be thinking, just based on this brief description, why Lamentations would be considered a part of the wisdom literature. Some Bibles even place it within the prophets because of its historical place in the exile. But it's seen as wisdom because even though we can place it within its historical context quite easily, the way it's written, in poetic verse, and the content that it addresses, what the fall of Jerusalem can mean for the spiritual well-being of the Israelites, speaks to something much deeper than historical retellings or even prophetic witness. It is a book that sits betwixt and between, but it resembles most closely the lament psalms. In the same way that the Psalms capture our desire for God's action and comfort, so the lament psalms give us words to recite in times of trial. The verse 19, the memory of my suffering and homelessness is bitterness and poison. I can't help but remember and am depressed. I call all this to mind, therefore I will wait. Certainly the faithful love of the Lord hasn't ended. Certainly God's compassion isn't through. They are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I think the Lord is my portion, therefore I'll wait for him. Just a few verses later in the same chapter 3, the author says, for the Lord will not reject forever. There is hope in God's power and salvation. These verses you may have heard out of context and how much stronger they may feel now that you know they were written by an author in the midst of a siege, knowing that their sins have brought them here and their city will fall, but their faith endures in the God that is above human wars. The author pleads for mercy, but also recognizes their own actions that led to this exile. Lamentations has a special meaning when its poetic and psalm-like words are seated within their context. Not only can we see how the same statements can prove timeless, the words of lamentation speaking to those that suffer from their own mistakes today, but also we know the rest of the story. We know that they do make it out of exile. We know that ultimate salvation comes in the form of Jesus Christ. The Bible is a collection of many different works, but when seen together, we see the grand picture of God's journey with his people, constant and steadfast, giver of wisdom and everlasting love.